Britain confirmed for the first time that regular UK troops are present inside Ukraine after Lance Corporal George Hooley died during testing of a new air defense system away from the front lines. Previously, any British involvement was assumed to be limited to special forces. Prime Minister Keir Starmer said the soldier's death resulted from a tragic accident. The acknowledgement comes as Starmer states the UK would consider sending forces as part of a peacekeeping coalition if an agreement with Russia is reached. Moscow has warned that deployment of NATO troops in Ukraine would escalate the conflict between nuclear-armed powers. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said officials would deliver updated peace proposals to U.S. negotiators, while also indicating Ukraine could hold elections within 60 to 90 days if international partners guarantee security and legal changes are made to enable wartime voting. His comments followed U.S. President Trump's criticism that Ukraine was using the war as an excuse to delay elections. Zelensky said voting must be safe amid Russia attacks and occupation of nearly 20% of Ukraine. The issue is politically sensitive as Russia claims Zelensky's term has expired. Zelensky has met European leaders seeking stronger support as U.S. aid declines. A new U.S. national security strategy favors improving ties with Moscow, alarming some European allies. The BBC internally admitted to inaccuracies in its reporting about former Congresswoman Liz Cheney and criticism from U.S. President Trump. BBC World News America previously claimed Trump suggested Cheney should face a firing squad, portraying his comments as violent escalation. In reality, Trump used a rhetorical argument questioning why Cheney advocated war while remaining safe, saying she should stand with a rifle aimed at her to understand consequences. An internal memo acknowledged the errors, though a public correction has not been issued. The case follows earlier criticism of the BBC for misleading edits of Trump's January 6 speech. President Trump has threatened to sue the broadcaster for up to $5 billion. U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer told a Senate subcommittee he's open to treating South Africa differently under a revised African Growth and Opportunity Act, or AGOA, calling Pretoria a unique problem. While the Trump administration supports a one-year AGOA extension, some lawmakers argue South Africa no longer aligns with U.S. interests, especially over its stance on Russia. South Africa, AGOA's largest beneficiary, also faces a new 30% U.S. import tariff and was excluded from recent G20 engagements. Greer urged removal of trade barriers if Pretoria wants lower duties. South Africa says it will continue lobbying to remain fully included. Egypt and Iran have formally objected to plans for an LGBTQ-themed pride match tied to their June 26, 2026 World Cup game in Seattle, coinciding with the city's Pride weekend. Local organizers, not FIFA, promoted the event as a celebration of LGBTQ culture and businesses. Both countries, where same-sex relations are heavily stigmatized, argue the branding violates their cultural and religious values. Egypt's Football Association submitted a complaint insisting the match remain focused solely on sport, while Iran's Federation president called the initiative unreasonable. Seattle will host 6 World Cup matches, including Egypt and Iran's Group G clash. Kemi Badenoch confronted Keir Starmer over caretaker leader status in a PMQ showdown.
We've just passed a budget which protected our public services and our NHS. No austerity which brought our NHS to the ground. We've created the conditions for economic stability with the headroom we need. And Mr. Speaker, we're concentrating on the single most important issue for families up and down the country, which is the cost of living, by taking £150 off their energy bills. That's in addition to the £150 for the 6 million of the poorest household. We're concentrating on what matters to the country. She's trying to save her job.
This has been James O'Neill for The World Today.
There is a problem with medicine, and we can explain what it is by looking back to the discovery of penicillin. Penicillin, it turns out, was not just an accidental finding. Alexander Fleming discovered that mold he found in a culture dish was killing bacteria, but it took over 10 years before a team at Oxford University were able to isolate the active ingredient. They produced small quantities for preclinical and clinical trials, helping prove the compound was safe and could beat infection. However, they couldn't produce it at scale. In 1941, Andrew Jackson Moyer of the US Department of Agriculture, the forerunner to the FDA, suggested changes to the manufacturing process, enabling mass production. It turns out medicines are not invented when someone discovers a new molecular entity. They are the product of key stakeholders working together collaboratively. Until medicine can be manufactured at scale, it may as well not exist. And in 2025, this is a problem. In the 1980s, pharmaceutical companies began outsourcing production. Suddenly the system was significantly less integrated. Someone with a new discovery today will find themselves disconnected from the rest of the development and manufacturing process. Companies that develop medicine are still happy to work with big established pharma companies, but the modern day Flemings are cut out of the system. The result is far fewer new medicines coming to market. We want to fix this by ensuring the pharma industry builds a more integrated supply chain. We also believe that doctors' expertise administering medicine should be included at the beginning of the process. We know that doctors on the front line have insights about how to repurpose medicine. Doctors should be able to report their findings so that the necessary testing can be completed and they can share their results worldwide. Learn more here and help us take medicines back to the future.
With your help, we can continue to fight for freedom, reach new audiences, and bring important information to the public free of charge. This is not possible without your generosity. Join our quest for the truth and our freedom and donate today, telling it as it is. This is today's News Talk, The World Today.
And thanks for joining us. This is the Protagonists in the World Today. Our topic is the New Zealand COVID inquiry. Nurses and teachers are speaking out. It's quite clear that the expensive inquiries about the so-called COVID-19 pandemic have been a whitewash. None of them from Australia, New Zealand or the UK have taken responsibility for the heinous crimes, nor have any leaders or senior public servants been charged or sacked, and of course these reports will not serve us in the future. The New Zealand Royal Commission is yet to give its final report, but the inquiry's processes have not impressed, allowing many who made decisions to avoid hearings altogether, and some important groups were completely ignored. Now, we'll learn about this later from our guest, and a guest just magnificent from New Zealand. No matter how you look at this, by the way, at this debacle, you just can't get away from the fact that governments treat their citizens like lab rats, and this still continues to this day. Politicians and the favoured elite were given vaccine exemptions, and those in the public sector were not. I wonder why that was. Not trustworthy, maybe. The results of the COVID experiment are horrific and clear to all, but it seems little justice will result unless we keep reminding the politicians that they work for us. And this must never, ever, ever happen again. Now, our guest today are Catherine Pick. She's a former school principal and was terminated during the mandates. Our other guest is now a friend of ours here at the World Today, Dr. Ursula Edgington. She's an educationist, a writer, and just a very good friend, and has some very, very interesting readings too. You should check her Substack. And Deborah Kuneliff, the Nurses Collective New Zealand, and a former clinical nurse specialist. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks, Mike. Good to be here.
And it's great to talk about this. But this, first of all, let's just cut to the chase. The inquiry was a complete farce, wasn't it?
Shall I start, ladies? I think there's difficulties about this word whitewash, because, yeah, you can argue that it was a whitewash from a certain perspective. Bear in mind, we haven't seen the final report yet, so we can't really say that. There's always a chance. But, you know, we knew from the very beginning that these COVID inquiries were framed in a totally unethical, inappropriate way. It was the clue is in the title, Mike. It says lessons learned. You know, what can we learn going forward? Basically, as Margaret and Alice would say, mistakes were not made. these were absolutely deliberate policies that were enforced, and there's no way that we can just ignore what has happened over the last 5 years. So yeah, it's difficulty. I try to stay away from that word whitewashed, because there is a lot of public recorded evidence now that's been submitted, and that's what we're here to talk about today.
Catherine, what do you think?
Yeah, well, as Ursula said, it remains to be seen what's going to happen, but we can predict fairly accurately that it is just going to be a repeat of what we've already experienced with the first one. They talked about going more broad with this particular inquiry, but it certainly hasn't been balanced in terms of the voices that they've heard, and we certainly never got a chance to represent our sector as well as we would have liked to.
And Deborah, just your thoughts too, please.
Yeah, obviously looking at how things are playing out globally, we can see that similar inquiries, just the results are not what would we expect. The truth isn't coming out. And I think, one of the key issues is it shouldn't need a Royal Commission of Inquiry to do the right thing. Any government, any leader should be doing the right thing without having to be told by a nice glossy leaflet that tells them you did this wrong, we think this should have happened. They should be doing it now. In fact, they should have done it 4 years ago. So that is my concern. I just don't know how effective this inquiry is going to be, but certainly there is nothing preventing our governments and our leaders from taking the lead now and doing the right thing.
Can you tell us, Ursula, if you wouldn't mind, what the mandated teachers and nurses did write? They actually wrote a submission to the COVID inquiry commissioners. Are you able to fill us in on that?
Yes. So we did a bit of research together. I used my academic background, really, with the help of both Catherine and Deborah, and we surveyed both groups' memberships via the various platforms like Telegram and Facebook that we had available to us. Deborah will probably talk to you a little bit about her Facebook experience, which wasn't great. But so we did a survey. We surveyed about 300 of the membership. Of course, it's unknown actually how many exactly nurses and teachers and other public sector workers were mandated out of their jobs, because a lot of them just disappeared into the ether. Some of them took early retirement. Some of them just resigned rather than being forced to leave. So it was all very, it wasn't an explicit kind of, the data wasn't there basically to tell us exactly what had happened. So we put together the responses, both qualitative and quantitative questions to the membership, and we collated those, and we wrote together two separate reports, one from the teachers representing the New Zealand Teachers Speaking Out with Science group, and one for the Nurses Collective, which is the group that Deborah Cunliffe founded and facilitates, coordinates. And it was originally called the Nurses for Freedom, and Deborah will tell you that now it's sort of evolved over time, as these things have, and is called the Nurses Collective New Zealand.
Deborah, can you tell us about your organisation, please?
Yes, so obviously when we started hearing about this virus that was coming out of Wuhan, I think deep down a number of us had concerns that something would happen. So we started meeting locally in the region where I represent at the moment. And then we quickly realised that if we were having questions and not getting the support from our employers, that there'd be other people throughout the country that would be in a similar situation. Now, remember, for your listeners, that only New Zealand's got about 5.5 million people, and that's in the entire North and South Island. So it's a tiny population, which means there's a tiny number of nurses currently on the register in comparison with places like Australia and like America. And so we very quickly realised that there would be hundreds of nurses in a similar situation to the one we were in. So we just started a Telegram page, and overnight we had, within 24 hours, we had 800 people join us, looking for guidance, looking for support, looking just to knuckle down under an umbrella where they could feel safe and talk about the things that they weren't being allowed to talk about in an employment setting. When the mandates happened, so the Covid-19 Public Health Response Vaccinations Order came into place on the 25th of October 21, and nurses and teachers, I think, certainly nurses, weren't allowed to go into work from the 16th of November 2021. In fact, many of our nurses were actually trespassed, so they could go to work up until midnight. So a lot of them finished work at 11 o'clock at night, walked off the ward, no thank you, no goodbyes, no anything, just even colleagues that have been really close to them. There was no acknowledgements of anything that was happening because it was all very top secret. Nobody was allowed to talk about it. So they just left. And that's the story that's repeated numerous times. Nurses who've been working 3-4 decades, walking away, not allowed to go back. But what we did was we provided a safe space for those nurses to go to. And actually we held 2 national days of action, and we had thousands of people supporting the nurses, doctors, anybody that was working in the health service, supporting us out on the streets from the top of the North Island to the bottom of the South Island. So we have done a lot of work, and obviously it's culminated in our submission to the Royal Commission of Inquiry.
I just need to ask, if you don't mind, Catherine, as a former school principal, your responsibility to the children and then to their families and so forth. This must have been extremely distressing for you, and you were laid off or dismissed, whatever you want to call it, sacked. How did that affect you?
Look, it was heartbreaking. It was such a huge loss. To be honest with you, if I was just saying to Ursula and Deb today that had I been interviewed even 6 months ago, I wouldn't have been able to do this without crying, because it's been such a traumatic experience. I just want to pick up on what Deb said about the leaving. It was the same with teachers. On the 15th of November, we were told we had to vacate the premises. We weren't allowed back. I was quite fortunate. I was allowed to come back and work after hours. Like, I wasn't allowed there when the children were there, but I could go there at nights and in the weekends when nobody was there. But that was only because I was a principal and still expected to do duties while I was waiting for my termination. But teachers were actually told that if, members of the public were told that if they saw a teacher going onto the school site, they could actually call the police. And the ridiculous thing is that as a teacher, you were not allowed onto your school site. But if you had children in the school, you were allowed to go onto the school premises as a parent. So there was really mixed messages, and it was just quite crazy how the whole thing was orchestrated.
Yeah, Ursula, the censorship and stigma associated with those speaking out against those mandates, it's still around, isn't it?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, Mike. I mean, one of the things that we've spoken about in the past is how other, even alternative media platforms in some ways control the narrative, and they just filter out certain voices. And it's a tragedy, really, that so many groups, and we're just, I'm here just representing 2, with the wonderful help of Deborah and Catherine. There's so many groups out there that just simply haven't had any opportunity to have their stories told. And there's been chosen special people that have been allowed to have private meetings with the COVID inquiry commissioners. We don't know really what was in those meetings. We don't know what the outcomes were. And we don't know why those people were chosen and not others. And we may never know. And it could be that after the report is finished, there is an allowance for Official Information Act requests. So that's definitely, in the long list of things that we would like to know about what went on behind the scenes. And meanwhile, as you say, the censorship just continues, and it's pretty intense. Yeah.
Yeah, it is very intense, and I have to say it's really hard. I mean, there used to be independent media or alt media, which I don't really like that term, but it was a media. Just about everybody became a journalist. I mean, give me a phone, give me a camera, give me a microphone, and I'll tell you the facts. And most of them didn't know the facts. They were, they have a right to be heard, but It's interesting nowadays to decipher who is telling the truth from whether it's independent media or whether it's government. I mean, they all seem to be almost coming from the same apple tree. Ursula, does that concern you that as we move forward, and probably forward is not a great word to use, but as we move, does it concern you that it's sort of melding into one now, that and for the general public to decipher who is telling the truth, it's actually getting to the stage where it is just becoming one, and those that have an opposite narrative, or up there, telling it as it is, they're being just written out, pushed aside, and you have this collective of the narrative all over again. And it seems to me what government has learnt and what media has learnt, they've learnt a lot from the days of COVID and what happened after, and so they've come back stronger. And it makes it harder for the general public and people throughout New Zealand or Australia, wherever, to work out who is telling the truth. Do you find that is possibly the case? And what do we do? How do we? I mean, unless people start coming out with articles and stuff, I don't know how we own and keep telling and telling. We're going down this terrible path, and it's all heading to this magnificent, one world government, which I never thought I would ever say, but it is getting to that stage.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that we've done, I've done personally recently, is starting to name and shame those people that do have hard and soft copies of these COVID submissions that we've done. Because these reports, this represents, bearing in mind it was all done on a voluntary basis, hours, days, weeks of working together, making sure that it was all totally accurate, well-referenced, academic references. And we were lucky enough to get some donations that allowed us to make some coloured hard copies bound. And in some cases, we wrote personal letters to people senior in New Zealand governments and other entities with a copy of the report, in maybe not in the expectation of any meaningful response, but at the very least, the courtesy of an acknowledgement, and zilch. So we've worked very, very hard to try to get the facts out. We've tried also very hard to learn about propaganda theory. I mean, you've probably spoken to David Charalambos's team in the UK, reachingpeople.net, which has got some fantastic resources on there about basically how to deprogram people from the propaganda. So we've tried lots of different strategies with lots of different people, and we have had some success, but that success has been restricted in terms of our opportunities to get the voices out there. And that's why we're very grateful to people like yourself, Mike, for allowing us to have this time to speak about the experiences of, in this case, the teachers and the nurses who were mandated out of their jobs and still haven't seen any justice 4 and a bit years on.
Deb, can we just some of the quotes from the nurses' report? Do you have those handy, and are you able just to fill us in a bit?
Yeah. Just before I do that, can I just add to what Ursula's just been saying? That obviously the reports have raised a number of ethical issues, ethical concerns of significance, not only because they affected the well-being and careers of healthcare professionals, but also because they have broader implications for public trust, patient care and integrity in the healthcare system. So when people have ignored our reports to the Royal Commission of Inquiry, or any reports that we've brought to their attention, they're actually dismissing Kiwis' health, and they're dismissing the public's right to have these issues raised and to be represented. So, they're not only just knocking and smacking our nurses in the face, but they're actually dismissing the right of your everyday Kiwi that was vaccinated to know the truth about what's going on. So it's a double whammy almost. But as far as some of the quotes, I mean, when Ursula asked us just to prepare a few quotes, it's tear-jerking stuff going back through this stuff again, because there's just so many quotes that it's like a dagger back into the heart again, because I've got one quote here that's quite long, but I'll speak quickly, and it says, "The era of government responses to COVID was for many nurses one of the most divisive and traumatic periods in modern New Zealand nursing history." And that stands today, that whether we nurses are vaccinated or unvaccinated, it's still an ongoing divisive issue. You can go into any hospital and talk about what happened, and even if nurses were vaccinated, they've still got we don't want to talk about it because it was a bad time. We're still struggling to recover. And you can see it in the burnout of nurses, the sickness levels, in the poor staffing levels on the wards because nurses are leaving. So high staff turnovers. So that's one that, one quote that kind of just will stay with me, that it's a traumatic period, full stop, in nursing. Another one from another nurse who she was a vaccinator, and she wrote about the fact that it has revealed to her the nature of human beings when psychologically influenced through mass media campaign of fear. She has amazing boundaries, but now she was saying professionally she would never encourage anybody to pursue mainstream nursing as a career because of the issues that she's faced. She also goes on to say she worked as a COVID vaccinator, but now suffers profound guilt and anxiety in case she caused any injury to children or pregnant women. These are true recollections from people that are horrified at the situation they were put in, and potentially something that may occur again. There's just so many stories of nurses being treated like criminals and with apathy, as if we personally offended their colleagues. People being, another one is about nurses, nearly 2,000 nurses were granted an exemption, but knowing they were thrown a lifeline, they still look down at us unvaccinated nurses with contempt. So this just goes to that continuing division within nursing and the current health crisis that we see around us. So, yeah, so many quotes to choose from, so many very brave nurses.
I just, Deborah, while you're there, don't you find it odd, and this is just not for New Zealand, it was right around the world, that the general populace, you have to get that jab, you'll live forever, or that, or develop reptile skin, whatever you wanted. But we had the government bureaucracy. Now, in a crisis, the thing that you keep alive, keep working properly, is the government and the bureaucracy, because that keeps the country going. So you would think if the vaccine, and surely your colleagues would have noted this, that if the vaccine was such a wonderful jab in the arm and it was going to save your life, that the first people to get it would have been those that are tasked to run the country, such as the government and bureaucracy.
Yeah.
But it was the other way around, and that should have already shown alarm bells, because if it was so good, safe and effective, then they would have been the first to take it. And that would have given the alarm bells, showing people that there's something not quite right here.
That's exactly right, Mike. The exemptions were given to politicians and a number of other people, including the exemptions that were given to thousands and thousands of healthcare workers and workers that probably work for places like the Beehive. I think the problem was, though, that at the time of, just thinking back to 2020, 2021, that fear that was ramped up in the general populace, people weren't seeing clearly, they weren't thinking clearly, they just wanted that jab in the arm to keep them safe and effective. And the messages, even now when we hear them, they, almost cause you to vomit, but just those messages that came on TV, the noises, the colours, the striking sounds that accompanied them, it was all to drive the population to get vaccines in arms. The vaccine passes, you're not going to be able to have a summer, you're not going to be able to go and have your hair cut, you can't go to school, you can't do this, you can't do that, all driven to drive vaccinations, as essentially were the exemptions, because the exemptions were only given for 6 months. So I wasn't offered an exemption. I did apply for one, but I was declined, and I on that note, I applied for my job 3 times and still didn't get an interview for my own job. But anyway, that's another story for another day. But, the exemptions basically were proven to be driving nurses back into vaccination, because that was the main premise of the exemptions. It will give you an exemption, but during that time, we're going to work on you so that you will at some stage get the vaccine before the 6 months runs out. So obviously they knew that a couple of thousand nurses were not going to fall foul to that reasoning, and had already critically assessed the dangers associated with the vaccine and said no. So they didn't even bother going after them. They just said, no, you can't have an exemption. So pure manipulation, pure propaganda. But, we're standing strong, Mike, and we're stronger and we're healthier than ever.
We are indeed, and I haven't got any reptilian skin, because I never got it. I mean, although I have to say, I have looked at a couple of flies of late, and they are looking young. Sorry, Catherine Pick. What about some of the quotes from the teachers' report?
Yeah, so I'll just read a few. We've touched on this one already. I was just escorted into the school on a Sunday to collect all my things, then escorted out. So no opportunity to spend time on there. Just no trust. The trust was just destroyed between those that were mandated and the people in the schools that they worked with, their colleagues. This one's really heartbreaking. I was stopped from going to my father's funeral by a hostile sister because she decided to only allow vaccinated people. This devastated me, and I was put on antidepressants as a result. Every time I drove past one of my local schools, I felt sick and knew that I was unable to even walk onto the property without the police being called. This one's from a principal. I was confused when my key no longer worked to open the block where my office was. I contacted a staff member and they brought me down a key. When I got inside the building, the alarm went off because, unbeknown to me, the alarm code had also been changed. Once I sorted that out, I tried to log onto my computer and couldn't because my computer had also been disconnected from the school server. No one had communicated any of this to me. So really, like evidence of no trust between the colleagues that were mandated and the ones that remained in the system. And then so people were sort of impacted massively, not only through their actual jobs and their careers with their colleagues, but also on in their personal lives with family who also treated them harshly for the decisions that they made. So someone's just said here, someone I considered as my best friend shut her door in my face when she learned I had been mandated.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's and I see that you are disappointed. My upset, and I don't blame you. My family, we had fractured my family because I was a very bad person. I was telling the world about how bad all these things were too. So I was a doubly bad person. And then we had my best friend. I've known this guy for years, and he wrote to me and said that I am a murderer because we're telling everybody not to take it. I couldn't understand what he was on about. And he still thinks that I was responsible for killing many people. And I think that's it's just abhorrent. Ursula, the frenzy from, did you find it amazing that how many people became experts, became epidemiologists, immunologists, the greatest doctors on the earth, just because they had read half a story or a byline or a headline, and they went to town on Twitter then, Facebook and all those which would ban you from having a contrary narrative. Did you find that disturbing? And it really hasn't gone away, has it?
No, not at all. And one of the interesting things that we found out in retrospect was that actually the government did know that, of course, schools, I mean, it's common sense, right? Kids generally are quite resilient little terrors. And there was some research done in terms of the transmission of the so-called virus. And they recognised even back then that this was, a nothing burger. And they just chose to ignore that evidence that was in front of them and go ahead with the mandate for the teachers anyway. So they knew what was happening in schools. They knew that the risk was low, and they just took orders from above. You know, we still don't really understand how that mandate came to be in place, because nobody was really driving it at that point. It was just somebody flicked a switch in government, and even though, as we've said before, you know, the actual vaccination order was illegal, and they recognised that in Parliament. And when you look at the Hansard from that particular entry, the MPs recognised that they'd done something that was illegal, and they just changed the law anyway and backdated it so that they could get away with what they'd got away with. So it's it's ongoing. I mean, I personally, if you want me quickly to share my story as well, my one of my roles was as a volunteer educator at the local prison, and so when the mandates came in for prison workers, because it was sort of level, you know, it was a criteria, it was rolled out slowly over the various public sector workers. And even though I was a volunteer, that the mandate still applied to volunteers. Bearing in mind also, for instance, our fire and emergency, entity here also is mainly run by volunteers because of the way New Zealand operates. And, you know, still there was this coercion, there was this propaganda, and the managers insisted that even though you didn't have a salary, you were still, you still came under this vaccination order. And one day I wasn't allowed on site, and nobody since that day, 4 years ago, has even rung me to say, Ursula, we would love to have your services for free. And the irony of that is, of course, most of my prisoner students weren't vaccinated themselves because they knew, they knew perhaps more than some of us do about the corruption within government. But yeah, it's fascinating to see even today. You know, it's just not discussed at all. Nobody wants to go there. They just say to you, if they do discuss it, it's all in the past, Ursula, let's move on. Let's move on.
What damage has this done to? I'll do Deborah with the health system and Catherine with the education and looking at the media. What damage has it done to the trust? The trusted media initiative. I feel like laughing when I say that. It's just not. But what damage has it done, and can they ever get back that trust?
Well, from a nursing perspective, obviously, the damage is like I've already said, it was the greatest divisive event in modern nursing history. And, we're not just talking about significant job losses, early retirements, many experienced professionals leaving the sector, but we can see from a health perspective, it's exacerbated workforce shortages and obviously impacted patient care. So, in our report, in our Royal Commission of Inquiry report, and it shouldn't be a little group of nurses who have come from nowhere to be making these obvious recommendations, but, the recommendations, we need all those nurses that were impacted and doctors and midwives and healthcare assistants and pharmacists and all the hundreds, probably a couple of thousand, which is a lot in New Zealand terms. They need to be reinstated. They need to be reimbursed. We need an apology. But bigger than that, we need to start looking at workforce policies and ensuring informed consent for everybody in New Zealand. We need fair and equal treatment. So the trust has gone, and it won't come back until all those aspects are managed. Now, we've already discussed corruption at so many different levels. You've probably seen the news recently in New Zealand about the police and the assistant commissioner for police being involved in some really, really dodgy behaviour, and, calling into question trustworthiness within the police, trustworthiness within the courts. And we've currently got the story of Barry Young, who is being prosecuted because he whistleblew on some data that he took from Te Whatuora our public health system that shows, according to Barry, shows thousands of premature deaths after people were vaccinated. But again, we're just seeing the judiciary close down on even the fact that he found that. In any other situation, if a person working in a healthcare system has concerns, they take it to the manager escalates it, and it's discussed in a fair and equitable manner. And if there is a problem, you deal with it. But it's almost anything that's got the C letter in front of it, such as COVID, there is no fair and equitable discussion, because you're not allowed to have that discussion about COVID, because the solution and the answers have already been decided on, and the possibility of the vaccine being not safe and not effective, it's off the table. So trust is hard comeback.
Ursula, what about in the media? Because I want to break this. I want the education part covered by Catherine. But what about with the media? Will they ever get their trust back? And the question being, did they ever have the trust? Were they just very good at hiding things, and they've done that for years? But I found that in Australia, for example, they often say we're laid back, relaxed. G'day mate, how you doing? All right. Don't move our lips when we talk. But I would describe Australia though. Some people would spell it the same way you spelled apathy, and that used to tick off people when I'd say that's how you spell Australia, because all right mate, there's a sound coming out of this, but they don't really care. And if you don't really care, then that's apathy. But the media loves that, because big headlines, man gets chased by a rat or something, and the byline, a bit of story about, but there's not much else in the papers. Trust has, in my opinion anyway, trust has gone in the media, not just legacy media, but also media. Stop.
Yeah, I mean, I could talk all night about this, but just very briefly, I was aware 10 years ago or 12 years ago when I arrived in New Zealand how corrupt the legacy media was, simply because of the poisoning, the aerial poisoning. And I know over in Australia, for instance, you've got this fire ant, poisoning issue happening. So, it's kind of a parallel environment, thinking that the government can eradicate certain pests, and they define who the pests are. And maybe we're the pests that are under attack to be eradicated. But even back then, I naively thought that getting information out there about the harms of these poisons would easily be picked up by either New Zealand media or one of the other major media platforms like The Guardian, who supposedly at that time was, left and people-centred. And it was a big wake-up call for me back then, just how the machinery works of the propaganda machine, the trolls on social media, all kinds of strategies, and that we learned, to some extent in the beginning, how to, navigate them to overcome some of the shadow banning and censorship. But the COVID era obviously brought that to a whole new level. And as I say, still today, last night we were experiencing it, where we were censored from one of the platforms that you'd expect not to be censored from. So, yeah, it's ongoing, and we just keep speaking out in lots of different ways, as much as we can.
Yeah, we have the e-safety bill. It's supposed to protect children, but it's not. Yeah. They've already worked out a way around it. I mean, we need children in our parliament. Hang on, we have got them. But I'm very bad. I'm going to go to hell, by the way. But it's really interesting, this e-safety thing. What they're going to do and what they want to do is to stop people from talking or being against that particular narrative, and that's all it is, because they have your data, they have all the information, and they go point, and you've stopped. But it's not just government. I think it's a whole collective of media people or media interest, and I think there is no trust at all at the moment, and I can count on my hand, and I think you'll attest to this, Ursula. There are very few on the independent media side of things that are trustworthy, and that's a real pity, because here was an opportunity to help and do good and manoeuvre yourself away from this. And it's, in many cases, it's just become as putrid as legacy media, and legacy media is putrid. And I don't think.
On that note, Mike, can I just add that, picking up on what Deborah said earlier about, you know, the nurses and the teachers this relates to, that were mandated out and did speak out and are still, you know, in the groups today, trying to speak out. Most of them, like 80% of them, were the ones that were in the age bracket that we're in, over 50, and in the you know, upper qualification, and, you know, with decades of experience in their respective disciplines, you know, whether it's teaching, education, primary, secondary school, higher education, different levels of teaching. They had a specialism that was highly valued and really, really needed, especially now in those institutions. And that is the experience that's being just deleted. And it's almost like it's literally, you know, in Orwellian terms, memory hold.
What about with the education system, Catherine? Will it ever get back its trust? I mean, I'm very critical of the education system, by the way. I think they teach a lot of garbage. They do. It's and I mean, in my days, I mean, I was in the corner so many times looking away from everybody because I was a bad egg. I needed some good representations, couldn't find one. But I just thinking though, we've gone off track, haven't we? So one, we need a better education system, but the damage it did during COVID and thereafter, can they ever get back their trust, or is this just irreversible?
Well, I think it's evident, and two factors actually that are happening in New Zealand, and one, of course, is the attendance problem. Our attendance was already a problem pre-COVID, like we had an 80% average attendance of students coming to school, but that dropped right down to 40% during COVID, and it hasn't really gone much above that since COVID, because even though the government like to think that you put a bit of spin on it and say that attendance is improving, it's actually not significantly. So we've got that problem. We've also got the highest rates of parents pulling their kids out and homeschooling them. So that's another thing that's quite a telling factor. But yeah, in terms of the what would I say? I'll just tell a little experience that I had when I found out I was unable to get an exemption like Deb. I actually contacted my Ministry of Education advisor, regional advisor, and I said to her, look, is it possible for me to work in my office, lock the doors, nobody comes near me, or people that are feeling safe, they can come and see me, but otherwise they can just stay away from me. And I'm happy to do daily PCR tests. And she just said, absolutely not. You have to be off the premises. You have to work from home. And yet I did an OIA probably about 2 years ago. And the very thing that she stopped me from doing, she was allowed to do. So when you've got that level of, the bureaucracy is allowed to, have these exemptions and these processes that protect them, and yet people working in the schools, that wasn't the case. So you can't get that trust back. That trust is eroded. I mean, certainly if they sort of came to me and said, hey, we're really sorry, we made a mistake. But can you imagine them ever doing that? They're not going to. So yeah, that's the level of trust that's happened for me, and I just know.
I'm just thinking, you're in the medical profession. You were. I'm just thinking. Remember those days when they would go to restaurants and they all had masks on, and to save yourself from looking like an idiot trying to put something in your gob with a mask on, you could remove it. And it was really, really polite of the virus, wasn't it, to say, hang on, we're not going to poison everybody and kill them, and you could eat, and then you put the mask back on again. The two things, one, that was something should have been out of Monty Python, but the second thing is, but this is, and again, I go back to just the general populace. On those boxes of masks, it said it is not to be used for that very purpose.
Yeah.
And then they're meant to stop you from passing the germ out. Yet everybody was wearing it so they wouldn't get it, and they didn't get it. And we had a guy on one of our shows. He was an anesthesiologist. Anesthesiologist. Hello. And he sleep. Anyway, he I was just about to say that word. He did this test on air, and he blew through the mask. He said one's molecule, one's particle, and the particle is actually smaller than a molecule. And you watch this. I've got a vape, and he blew through that and came out everywhere. Came outside and through it. He said, "Now, what would that do if that was a particle?" And he made a magnificent point. He said, "These aren't working. Never meant to work." And then he was almost lost his gig over it to go and take off all of these viral videos. But it just showed you, though, the amount of fear that the medical profession and government threw at the general population, for example, of New Zealand. It just showed you that most people, because of the fear of death, they would believe anything. And that's where the propaganda came in, and that's where Ursula, we talked about the media, and that's where the education system, it all worked lockstep with each other, and the delivery of that lie was just about near perfect, wasn't it?
Yeah, the interesting thing about those conflicting ideas and rules is actually that is part of the propaganda. That's the way propaganda works. And in a sort of a counterintuitive way, if you have rules like that don't make sense, they're actually more powerful. People actually believe them more. It's just the most bizarre reverse kind of psychology. So that's why people were so keen to tune in every day at 1 o'clock or whatever it is for, the podium of truth, in terms of Jacinda's, diktats. And it was the same as we saw in other countries. Every day there was the briefing. These are the new rules that contradict yesterday's rules, and tomorrow they'll be changed again. And that was literally that, abuse of power. The people that were propagandized they were so fearful, they needed to be told what to do. And even if the instructions were totally ridiculous, in fact, the more ridiculous they were, the more likely they were to follow them. It's crazy when you look back on that now. And no wonder people are so embarrassed. They don't want to revisit that shame that they will inevitably feel. And we feel sorry for them, don't we? Really,
we do. But isn't it interesting? Isn't it interesting? Deborah, they often say the so and so and anti-vaxxer, and they still do it, Deborah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to add there, Mike. Sorry for interrupting. I was just going to add, Ursula's quite right about the vague messaging and the change in messaging and the lack of clarification. But actually, this has been coming for years from a nursing perspective. So whereas nurses think that they're autonomous, independent practitioners and we're always pushing through the barriers and, becoming better at what we do and taking on more tasks that have historically belonged elsewhere, i.e. doctors, actually, nurses are becoming more like puppets and more prisoners of their own success because we're told how to think and within what boundaries we can think. So really, any nurse that was an independent, critical thinker should have stopped and thought, that message isn't clear. That message about wearing masks is not what we do in theatre. We don't wear masks in theatre to protect ourselves. We do it to protect the patient from our breath and from particles that we may breathe out on an open wound. Why are we being told an alternative message out in the supermarkets and on the wards, etc.? But nurses didn't do that because for years they've been primed to believe that they're critical, reflective thinkers. But actually, all this time, and it's the same in all academia, we're just being told what to think, how to think, and being churned out with a certificate that is probably meaningless because actually you're just reiterating and regurgitating what they want you to say. And, we could talk about this for a long time, but, and I think add that into the messaging that is clearly occurred at 1 o'clock every day, plus the understaffing and this fear of the virus. And you can just see how everybody capitulated to the prevailing narrative. So yes, I do hold my colleagues responsible for the decisions they made then and continue to make now. But I can also see how it's happened because we've been primed, absolutely 100% primed through years and years of study. It doesn't prove anything.
Just quickly, as we're going to wrap this up in a second, but not just so quick because I've got all these questions I want to talk about. Where to now with the education system? What do we have to do, Catherine? How do we fix it?
I mean, I think it's a case of building better systems. I mean, we've currently got a system that's so entrenched with the unions, and it's really, really difficult to work outside of the unions. But there are a number of private schools that are doing different things. But I don't really have the answer to that. I think it's just a case of building systems outside of government, and that goes for everything, regardless of what sector you're in, because we're just going to be continually restricted. Have these laws and rules put around us that make things really difficult to work with if you stay within the government bounds.
Yeah. One of the things I'm doing, Mike, is helping supporting the parents, because I think parents need encouragement. You know, they may not have the confidence to homeschool their kids, but there are groups of homeschoolers that get together regularly, that share ideas and, you know, make tremendous progress. And you can normally recognise, you know, a child that's been brought up outside of the system pretty quickly. First of all, they're not stuck to their bloody phones. But you know, there is progress happening in these parallel communities. So it's not all negative. People are learning. It's a very steep learning curve. And certainly in terms of health as well, Deb knows all about the holistic perspectives in terms of that growing educational environment, teaching people to take responsibility for their own health as well as their own learning.
Can we fix it though, Ursula?
Probably not in our generation, Mike, but at some point, yeah, we'll make progress enough. Yeah, I'm an optimist, as you know.
You are indeed.
Yeah.
I'm not. There's two trains at the moment. Deborah, can we fix it?
In our submission to the Royal Commission of Inquiry, we made 10 recommendations, which they won't fix it, but they'll start that journey of hope and change. So, you know, things like a government apology and reinstatement, I mean, those are just very practical. But, you know, we need to be looking at things like non-discriminatory policies that don't discriminate against unvaccinated nurses going next. We need to put safeguards in place. So we're not asking for $1 trillion. You know, we're asking for policies that protect those people that have been through this trauma. Things like independent reviews of our regulatory bodies. You know, obviously there's the common sense things, so, you know, investigation of the adverse events for not only our colleagues that are impacted by the vaccine injury, but for the rest of New Zealanders and Australians that have, been hurt. Respect for informed consent. Again, we're not asking them to travel to the moon for us. We're just asking for basic human rights that should never have been put out there and squandered. Protection of our rights, protection of thought, opinion and conscience. And obviously Ursula's baby, you know, review of this behavioural science interventions and the things that shouldn't have happened, and you know, an understanding that they were used negatively to persuade people to do things that they shouldn't have been persuaded to do. So, you know, there are lessons that can be learned, and this should be being done now without having to go through a Royal Commission of Inquiry. These are just common sense things. And until people in New Zealand, the general public, are hurting enough, and until they realise what happened then and is continuing to happen now, I don't think it will be fixed. But when enough people are impacted by harm, whatever that harm looks like, then it gets personal, doesn't it? So then they may start asking for some of these recommendations and for accountability of duty of care. So who knows? Like Ursula, hopeful. Yeah, we'll see.
A good whiskey always helps. The third one, I mean, glass, not bottle either, by the way. Just quickly, now we started talking about the inquiry. Catherine, your thoughts on the final report?
Unlike Ursula, I'm not an optimist. I don't really have much faith that it's going to produce anything positive, to be honest. I still believe that the positive results will come from the people, and people will drive the change, and it's never going to... The government will always be defended.
Yeah, I totally agree there. Ursula, your thoughts on the final report?
Yes, well, we'll see. I mean, it's from a positive perspective, we've got it on record. We've got it on the public record for future generations to look, read, try to understand what happened, and hopefully that in itself will form part of whatever the changes are ahead, whether we live to see those changes or not. So, yeah, the reports, by the way, I should add before we finish that they are freely available. If you check out my Substack, Informed Heart, on Substack, then you can download the PDF files for free.
And Deb, your thoughts on the final report?
I'm not going to hold my breath.
Your one. Good on you. Catherine Pick, Dr. Ursula Edgington, and Deborah Cunliffe, thank you so much for your time. I've enjoyed this immensely. You've laughed at my jokes. I appreciate that. No one else does. But it's been a real pleasure. But it's also a very serious topic. I'm seeing that train coming towards us. I'm with you, Catherine. It's a big train, and I think there's one behind it too. So but I think also with Ursula, I think not in our generation, but I think things will eventually get back. To me, that's entirely depressing, because for the short term, they're winning, and we just got to keep fighting. But the trick is, though, to work out who's on your side, as you would attest to, Ursula.
That's right. Yes. Yeah.
Good reading coming up. It makes me nervous. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Mike.
This has been The Protagonist from New Zealand. Well, I'm in Australia, only 3 hours from New Zealand. The Protagonist on The World Today. Thank you very much. We'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you.